Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome. We are excited that so many of you could join us for today's event with Thomas Hübl and Dr. Richard Schwartz on expanding the map of trauma healing. My name is Laura Calderón de la Barca, and you may recognize me as one of the hosts from the Collective Trauma Summit. I'm happy to be here co-hosting this event today. A few quick technical announcements before we get started. Closed captions are available for this event. For those of you joining us on Zoom with a computer, you can turn on closed captions by clicking the live transcript/CC button found at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you don't see it, click More, and then you'll find the CC button there. If you're joining us on Zoom with your mobile device, closed captions should appear automatically, and if not, mobile users can tap Settings, then tap Meeting, and then you can toggle closed captioning to on. If you're finding us on YouTube, the closed captions cannot be turned off. If you have technical issues or questions, please email our support team at onlinecoresupport@thomashubel.com. Those of you who are here with us on Zoom can submit a written question at any time by clicking on the Q&A button found at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you don't see it, select More and you'll find the Q&A button there. We have had many people reaching out and wanting to learn from Dr. Schwartz and Thomas, who will be offering a 6-session course called Connect, Restore, Reclaim, Healing the Interconnected Legacies of Individual, Ancestral, and Collective Trauma. Enrollment is now open, so if you think you may be interested, you can visit the webpage connectrestorereclaim.com or check your email after the event today for more information. If you're watching the replay, you can click the link on this page to find out more. The course starts April 25th and will include 6 online sessions where Dr. Schwartz and Thomas will do live process work in each of the 2-hour sessions, as well as offer teachings, answer questions, and more. We invite you to explore whether this might be a good fit for you. For those of you who are new to Thomas and his work, here's a brief description. Thomas Hübl is a teacher, a speaker, author of the book Healing Collective Trauma, a process for integrating our intergenerational and cultural wounds, and founder of the Academy of Inner Science. His lifelong work integrates the core insights of the great wisdom traditions and mysticism with the newest discoveries of science. For the last 20 years, he has been leading large-scale events and courses that focus on the healing and integration of trauma. His next book will be released in September, and it's entitled Attuned, Practicing Interdependence to Heal Our Trauma and Our World. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura.
Sorry, and for those of you who are new to Dr. Richard Schwartz and his work, he is the creator of Internal Family Systems, a highly effective evidence-based therapeutic model that depathologizes the multi-part personality. His IFS Institute offers training for professionals and the general public. He is currently on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and has published 5 books, including No Bad Parts, Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with the Internal Family Systems Model. Welcome, Dr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Laura.
And I'll start by handing this over to you, Thomas, and I'll ask you first to share a bit about the title of the event today. What do you mean by expanding the map of human healing, of trauma healing, sorry?
Yeah, so first of all, a warm welcome to everybody that dials in at the moment and listens to this. And at the same time, I'm very happy, Dick, that we are sitting here today and that we are embarking on this journey together. So I'm very happy, and I'm curious also to learn, that we learn from each other about our different approaches. So yes, I think the last 20 plus years taught me that the Western, what I sometimes call the Western hypnosis with individualism or hyper-individualism, it needs some kind of update. And as I went through this long period of developing the work, I saw more and more how important it is to do the individual healing work and to do that carefully and with care and with competence. But at the same time, also to expand the map, and that's why we call it expanding the map of trauma healing, to include that an individual is also based on a lot of information that comes from our ancestors and is based on a lot of information that is in the collective. So the individual, ancestral, and collective healing work are not three separate things, but it's actually like a continuum, it's a fluidity. And we all know that trauma creates somehow like stagnations, creates frozen parts, creates parts that we need to reintegrate. And I would love to hear afterwards, Dick, how you speak about that. But that the liquefaction, the creating more fluidity through the healing work is actually opening up that map naturally for us. And so I think we are both very passionate about opening up the map and including a wider frame. And I know that, Dick, you, in reclaiming different parts, you also talk about legacy burdens and collective legacy burdens. And so I think there's a very fruitful conversation between us, although we have somehow different approaches to the healing work. We have a passion for kind of the same expansion, and I think that's why we are sitting here today. And maybe, Dick, you wanna just chime in here? I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Again, thank you for that beautiful intro. I thoroughly agree with the way you portrayed the goal of this for me as well. It does feel like we've been on kind of parallel tracks, and this is a really good time to meet in a bigger way. We've met several times before, but I'm really, really excited about partnering with you in something, or at least it just feels like, you know, I've been at this 40 years. I started on this journey. This is the 40th anniversary, actually. And in the earlier days, I was just trying to create the map for that inner territory. And then over time, like you, I've become aware that that particular inner map can be applied to companies and countries and international relations, and have been moving more and more to the macro level as much as I can. And then I heard about your work and got excited because I could see you were ahead of me in that way, and had been thinking about what I call legacy burdens or collective trauma, and actually doing things at larger levels. And so I've been really excited to try and collaborate in some way and compare notes for a long time. So that's what I'm hoping happens here. And yeah, so it's just a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, likewise. It's beautiful to be here with you. And of course, we had some pre-conversations to this, and we met in other circumstances. And but we always felt that there is a beautiful resonance. And it's also beautiful to explore the differences and the similarities between our work streams and how they interact. And so, first of all, I want to underline what you said, that when we do the individual work and we begin to expand it, there's always a twofold, and I'm curious what you say to that. There's a twofold or two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's I believe absolutely necessary to take off a bit the hyper individualized identification to open that up more, that we are actually part, and the self is not just that small box that we call person, but it's actually a much bigger field. And starting to breathe in that field opens up many more possibilities, that we see the ancestral information is real information that flows through my body. I actually think that our nervous systems have like an ancestral part to the nervous system that channels ancestral data. And that when we learn to use that nervous system, we are also much more attuned to the ancestral data, or to the lack of the flow of that data. And I believe the same is true for the collective. We all have a collective nervous system, and we are part of a collective nervous system. And there's much more data exchange, and often trauma obviously impairs that data exchange, so we feel more separate. But I believe sometimes we mixed up that feeling of separateness with a sense of individualism. And I think loosening up the trauma contraction shows us naturally that we are breathing much wider into the collective space. And that also creates much more participation in the collective space. And I believe that's why I think the course is so timely, is that in this time where we're actually breathing collective air locally, I believe we all need to be able to participate and collaborate collectively. But the large-scale wounds, as you said before, legacy burdens kind of countries or states or parts of our planet, need to be integrated in order to, for example, for us to be able to deal with climate change. And collaborate collectively and globally without all the sand in the engine that seems like slowing down. And that's why I think what we are going to talk about has a real urgency also in the contemporary situation that we are in, where we see democracies are threatened often by the whole polarization and disruption. We have wars, we have climate change. I think these are all topics that also need to be taken in account when we do collective work. And I'm curious how you look at that.
Yeah, again, I'm going to totally agree with you, but use different words. So in terms of the urgency, my whole MO up over these 40 years has been to just kind of wait and trust that I labored in relative obscurity for a long time, but I just kind of had faith that the right time will happen. And now IFS has gotten more popular, and I've been getting guidance that, yeah, there's more urgency to bring our two perspectives, as well as several other people's perspectives, to the cultures, and make that they can make a big difference. And so that's been challenging for me, because I still have parts that can't believe we've gotten this far, and I'm still waiting for the right person to come and take it where it's supposed to be. But I've been doing a lot of work with those parts. And, I don't want to sound apocalyptic or messianic or anything, but I do believe that it's time for people like us to begin to partner more. Each of us can only do so much by ourselves. And so that's some of why I'm excited about this. And yes, I agree that trauma has the impact of bringing up what I call these protector parts, who now carry the burdens of loneliness, and everybody's dangerous, and they do keep us more isolated and more focused on ourselves rather than on the collective. And that as we unburden those parts and help them out of these extreme roles they were forced into by the traumas, and that releases what I call self, which is characterized by 8 C words: calm, curiosity, confidence, compassion, clarity, creativity, and connectedness. I might have missed one, but that C word, connectedness, is a lot of what we're going to be talking about. And that once those protectors, open space, and you access that place, you automatically start to feel what you were talking about, how at this other level, we are all connected, and how important it is to take care of each other and to actually begin to bring changes that produce less trauma in the world. And legacy burdens, like you're saying, are a big part of that, because the history of violence on our planet is enormous, and those aren't one-off events. Those create ripples that we all carry pieces of, and that produce more violence. So so basically I'm just translating a lot of what you just said.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I want to underline that I think this is the time for much more collaboration and synchronization of various fields. And I'm very much along the lines there with you. And I also want to speak a little bit to and I think what we're also going to look at in the course is like how we do our individual work, however we do it, like properly, so that we create a proper holding space in ourselves and some kind of discernment, because it's easy to bypass the individual work or pain or trauma by looking just at the collective. But I think we are not doing that. We're giving that the appropriate space, and we are expanding the map. It doesn't mean that we are replacing that. And I think that's maybe important to also say. And then also how we, I think, through really owning these different levels of kind of separate parts or dissociated trauma information or impaired data flow in the social network, that's the way to become a citizen of a world that is different. Because if we see, we are coming out of thousands of years of power over hierarchies and a lot of pain and violence, as you said. And I think in order to create a different system, and I even would say that the evolutionary fuel changed, not only the fuel from fossil fuels to electricity or hydrogen, but from competition, which was long-term a fuel of evolution, into collaboration, which makes much more sense in this kind of densely populated world. And that's why I think that change is only possible when in between we go through a valley of healing. And I'm also interested in one thing, and then I would love to maybe bring in some of the questions that many people wrote in that I think address some of the things that we want to talk about. Like that like when we have to go through a valley, and we see this in some societies at the moment, that democracies feel challenged by what I would call a detox mechanism of trauma, ancestral and collective trauma, that needs to come up to be digested in order to create more resilience. And that healing always creates a deeper resilience. And I would love to hear you speak about that when we see, because it might look like at the moment that many places in the world are a bit shaky, and how you look at that, because I see in that also like a detox process of exactly the individual, ancestral, collective healing work we need to do in order to stabilize ourselves on the next level of development.
Yeah, there's so many things I could take off on what you just said. One would be, again, some of the parallels. So when an individual gets traumatized and doesn't have anybody to help them, they'll sort of automatically try to lock away the parts that were hurt the most and are frozen in time during the traumas. And as you exile those parts of you, you become more delicate, the world's more dangerous because so much could trigger that. And so you have other parts get into these protector roles, and these other parts often think the last place you want to go is to look at what happened when you got hurt, because you don't want to feel any of that anymore. You don't want to be overwhelmed by it. And you want to have a rosier outlook about yourself and about life, even though these other parts know better. And so if you apply that to a country like our country, like the United States, I don't mean your country, which is Israel. And we could talk about Israel too. we've got lots of exiles, and not only because of racism and patriarchy, but also economic exiles. This is probably the biggest gap in income in the world, and we don't want to think about any of that. We don't want to look at, we have culture wars around whether slavery should be even mentioned in schools. So just like in a trauma survivor who's got a denying part and really tries to minimize what happened to him or her in the past, our culture has a denying part as well that's very active in the United States right now. And then also has these individualistic parts that are really focused on, how can we get the most money for ourselves? And you see that writ large in corporations, and how much power we can get, and how dangerous other systems are, how we have to compete all the time instead of cooperate. So all of that is the product of the trauma and the protectors that come to take over at all these different levels, and then create increasing polarization and separateness, sense of individualism increases. And so, yeah, again, I'm just kind of playing off of what you're saying.
That's great. So maybe we let some of the questions come in, and then we can both respond to some of because there's so hundreds of questions came in, and so we want to respond to some that reflect bigger chunks of questions that came in, but with a similar topic. And maybe Laura, do you want to?
Yes, Thomas, thank you. We did receive many questions before the event today, and we would love to address some of them as we take some questions also via the Zoom Q&A for a bit later. So let's get started then with this. On the topic of ancestral trauma, how do we work with parts that are holding the trauma from our ancestors? The question, it says, I can feel when the trauma isn't mine. I work through it as if it is. Other ideas?
You want to start, Thomas? Or
Maybe you start, since it asks about parts. You're the specialist on parts.
Okay. So that's very common. And, as I got more and more hip to the fact that some of these burdens aren't what we call personal burdens that came from your personal history, but are passed down through the generations, or in your ethnic group, or are just floating around in our culture, then increasingly I would come to parts, and the parts would often spontaneously say, when we would get to them and say, what's driving you? What is forcing you to be such a workaholic, for example? And they would say, well, there is this impulse in me, but I don't think it's mine. And so at some point I got more curious about that and began asking, do you have any sense of where it came from? And people began witnessing scenes that clearly went from their lives, but maybe came from ancestors from generations ago, and started talking about how this just came into them and that they've been carrying it. And so then I began asking, are you at all interested in not having to carry this? And some parts would say, yeah, I don't want to carry it. I didn't know that I could give it up. And so we can just, what we call, unburden it. Other parts would say, I really think I have to. I'll betray my people if I don't carry this, or my mother wants me to hold on to this, and so I don't forget what happened to her. Or there's a variety of common fears about giving up these legacy burdens that we've gotten pretty good at addressing each of the fears, and sometimes even asking the dead relative to come in and have the person ask if that relative wants them to carry it. And so one of the sort of rules of this inner world is that once a part wants to unburden, it can. So then we would ask what it wants to give it up to: light, water, fire, wind, earth, anything else. picks one of those, we have them just send it off. And if that isn't working, we know there's some other part that's blocking and doesn't want it to be unburdened. And so then we root around and find that part and see what that's about. So anyway, that would be the way, the typical way we handle that kind of legacy burden.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's so interesting how we use very different language. But one more addition, and then not to repeat some of the things. Like when we look at in our work at ancestral trauma, like we can see as trauma in general as a kind of a split off data package in the system that was too overwhelming, so it has been split off and potentially shut down. And so when we look at ancestral trauma, the trauma in our ancestors is in a way disembodied information. It's disembodied energy. It becomes like a ghost. And not the ghost that we see in films, but it's or also collective trauma is like a collective fog. But we have been born into that. So somehow naturally we sit in the reverberation of the disembodiment. And I think the blessing of being alive in a body is that we have the chance to repair information through being embodied. And so it's beautiful when you speak about examining deeper and deeper places. So we fill those places with awareness, and eventually they can integrate and can be released. So that's beautiful. Yeah, and the rest I would just repeat things. So let's continue.
Thank you, Thomas and Dick. And there's a question that refers to how we can. It says in IFS therapy, the key to healing is to bring wounded parts in connection to self. And how can this be recreated on a collective scale? And for you, Thomas, what is the key to healing when we're working as individuals with the collective dimension of life?
Yeah, so I've worked with many clients where you start out and there's no what I call self to be found. They're very dominated by protectors. And those protectors are polarized with each other, and they're keeping the client very isolated and feeling alone. And it feels pretty hopeless. And then as I start to interact with their parts and ask them to open space, and what I call self emerges, everything starts to shift and can shift actually quite quickly. Sometimes it takes quite a while to convince the parts that it's safe to not run things and to allow self to emerge. But once self becomes more of in the lead and starts to relate to these parts in a healing way, or in a loving way or compassionate way, a lot of things can shift very quickly. And so to parallel that to at least our country, currently there are all these polarized protectors who are fighting all the time, thinking that their system is the right one. And there are all these exiles that I mentioned earlier, so there's so much pain in our country right now. And with that kind of pain in any level of system, you get increasingly polarized and controlling protectors. And there's very little self to be found, at least in the politics currently. And I'm convinced that if we can, the two of us and other people, collectively begin to bring more self to this level of system also, to have more self-led leaders, that actually, just like in the individuals, a lot of things can change and heal fairly quickly. And as we've been talking about, there's some urgency about this, not only because of climate change, but I'm also involved with people that are very concerned about AI, and there's just lots of urgency right now. So,
yeah, I agree totally. And maybe to add, so not repeat things that you said already. like when we look at collective healing, we really need collective healing, and that's why what you're talking about, the collaboration with various people to create networks in order to create collective holding spaces, because our society doesn't have, besides self-organized spaces, like we don't have in the societal constitution anchored that the society needs to take responsibility for its legacy or for its legacy burdens in your terms. So we don't have that anchored. So that we take care of the collective traumatization of our society as a way to bring health and well-being and collaboration, and also the increase of conscious awareness in the societal field. So then we are kind of trying to shadow fight with the symptoms that the collective traumatization creates within the societal frameworks. And so beginning to collaborate on that, there's a difference between an individual talking about collective and an individual beginning to sense the collective. But in order to sense the collective, or to sense ancestral wounds, or to sense oneself, we need to have a certain internal development. And so I think many people did individual work so that we have a base to expand and train and integrate our ancestral fields, which opens our ancestral nervous system. And I think many indigenous or cultures or mystical traditions have a very refined awareness of that quality of our nervous systems, and when we expand that even more, that our collective nervous system is kind of stuck in various places, and system sensing capacities that help us to not just talk about the collective, but to really be attuned to the collective and raise the awareness of that collective process. And I think that's very interesting. And for that, we also need individuals that are willing and able to connect to the collective space, but also we need collectives to do collective healing work. And we talked about certain collaborations, think about collaborating on much bigger, large-scale healing events on certain collective burdens. And I think that's the technology we need, technology in the sense of consciousness technology, that we need in order to take care of these larger wounds. So we have to do that together, and also together in big spaces that create a certain synchronization. And that can help us, like in individuals, to upgrade the internal coherence, and so that the self, or what I call the higher organizing principle, can actually orchestrate that movement.
Beautiful answers. Thank you both. And starting also with the questions that came in, and just wanting to say that I believe these questions are sometimes profound and complex, and I don't think that we can do a real honor to the question, but it feels important to acknowledge that these questions have been asked. How can we address and heal trauma an individual is going through ongoing harm such as racism or injustice? And an additional question connected to this: how will we ever heal individually as a society when poverty places people in a constant state of fear due to being in survival mode? The rich create individualist parts and the poor are survival exile.
Maybe you want to go, Dick, first?
Okay. So that's a big question, and it is a big obstacle to in my work. For example, when I'm working with a BIPOC person who on a daily basis is getting triggered by interactions, at least in the United States, it's just much harder for that person's protectors to say, yeah, it's safe, especially if I'm a white person and they're Black. Even with me, we have to clear out a lot of the issues between us first. And then if they are being triggered on a daily basis or activated, we have to work with those protectors and validate how hard it is to live in this culture, and how how they've protected them by not going to the vulnerability a lot of the time, and just honor that. And at some point, open the possibility of, if they'd be willing, we could heal some of these parts that are frozen in the past. And then it's not going to change the outside world. It's not going to make it safer in that sense, but it can allow for less activation every time that happens, and being able to deal with the activation in a different way. So yeah, I don't want to in any way minimize the dilemma for people who are in that context. And sometimes it isn't going to happen. There is too much of a need for them to stay protective, which I totally get. I totally understand. And as a white person, it's hard for me to fully understand. I don't pretend to get it all, but I totally honor their protectors.
Yeah, again, I don't want to repeat too much given the time we have. And as you said, Laura, I think the complexity of these questions need a bigger space. And also throughout the course, we will have one module that is entirely dedicated to that, so that we have much more space to expand on the questions. Like, maybe just to underline one thing you said is that first of all, I think you and I both think we are very respectful in our work of all the defense mechanisms being intelligent functions that totally made sense, or we could even say were the best option to choose in that intelligence in the given circumstance. Mm-hmm. And I think just that kind of approach that you just spoke about, like how we stay related to the defense mechanism as an intelligence and develop a relationship with it, and then supporting as much as it's possible the inner coherence to grow, like integrate step by step. And that doesn't mean that we need to give up on the defense mechanism, because that serves an intelligence. But still, the base inside can be slowly grown into more internal safety or more internal strength or resilience. And I think the other step is also to look at how to create an environment, like a supportive environment that can create some stabilization. And then I think the other part of the question is, how do we, like everybody that has privilege, take this question very seriously? And what does that mean for our lives and the way we are willing to change our lives? And I think if we go deeper into the cultural legacy burden of racism and slavery, or also here in the Middle East, like the tremendous amount of trauma that is right now very active, is how do we allow the structural change that needs to happen, and be very mindful of the collective defense mechanism and not externalize them, but make them part of our relatedness, so that can change. And I think that needs a lot of skill, but it's a very important work that we need to do in order also to change a lot of the socioeconomic differences in our countries. I think privilege means responsibility, and taking more responsibility and being willing to change more and to look more and stay dedicated to the process and not turn away from it when it's possible. And I think that's a very strong, I think we will talk more about that, because I think today there's not enough space for that to go deeper into.
Yeah, and I want to mention that one of our sessions will be led by an IFS lead trainer named Fatima Finney, who is really powerfully attuned on these issues.
Thank you both. And our next question is, as someone involved with community building on the local level, how do non-therapist individuals support community healing and well-being?
Why don't you start with that one, Thomas?
Yeah. Yeah, that relates a little bit to what I spoke to already. I think creating trauma-informed spaces, like trauma-informed leadership, trauma-informed organizational development, like trauma-informed community building, that's not only for therapists to do or for trauma-trained facilitators and therapists that had a high training in dealing with complex traumatization, but that's for anybody who accumulates enough trauma knowledge, not to be a therapist, but to be able to create architectures that are mindful and are sensitive enough to create spaces where healing and togetherness and groundedness and the slow melting of the defenses that we talked about can happen in a safe way. And I think for that, like, to be trauma informed doesn't mean that we need to be therapists. It means that I'm willing as a leader in a community, in an organization, or as basically everybody, as a parent and as people who are engaging voluntarily in community building, that we know enough to be part of a what we call in our work collective competence building. And I think that collective competence building is very, very important, and is actually the collective competence and the competence of professionals need to work together in order to create like the maximum impact within a social space. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is that healing is, in a way, I refer to healing through two metaphors. One is healing is the restoration of the original movement. So when trauma is kind of often frozen information that is unupdatable and frozen in time, the healing is the restoration of the original movement of that part or that quality or that developmental level of a person that synchronizes itself with the rest of the development. So is the same in the culture. And another way to think about healing is to create the right environment for it, so that we develop holding spaces that are able to, or an architecture in the society that fits to that specific society. So that's not a generic thing, that's an attuned process, and that might change over time as the society heals. We might change the approach and the architecture because the cultural environment is changing. So there's an evolution. It's not just one method, it's like a constantly growing method, a little bit as you described it before. You start working somewhere, but then the work led you to the next step and the next step and the next step. So it's not a stuck method, it's a kind of a fluid method that is constantly growing. And I think we need the same architecture that fits to that cultural space. And I think we are responsible to build it until governments will step in and be willing to that's an inherent part of the cultural framework.
Thank you both. And a couple of questions came in from our viewers that feel very important to address. How do we navigate and coexist with parts of us that are wounded and in pain and demand to be seen and felt, especially when we know that being more in touch with the pain could overwhelm us and create more dysfunction? And also, it feels very overwhelming, the amount of trauma in the world, especially the legacy burdens. How can we face the feeling of overwhelm? So what are some resources, some practices that people could take away from being here today that could support us with the amount of overwhelm already present in our world?
I could start with that one. So when I go to work with a trauma survivor, and we work with the protectors first that are so committed to not going to their exiles, to not, and the biggest fear, I'd say by far, if you ask a protector, what are you afraid would happen if we open that door, is the overwhelm. And for many of these clients, that's happened. Every time an exile got triggered, they got overwhelmed and they couldn't function and they laid in bed for a week. And so their protectors become more and more committed to never letting that door get opened again. And so we've had to come up with ways to convince these protectors that we know how to keep that from happening, that we can actually open the door and you'll feel some of the trauma, but you'll still be able to stay in what I call self and actually unload a lot of the trauma instead of be overwhelmed by it, have it dominate you. And so in our course, we can talk more about the specifics of how to do that. But again, I think the same process is happening at a cultural level, where a lot of the resistance of looking at racism and looking at slavery and looking at white supremacy is, if I look at what's happened in anything that I've been contributing to that, I'm going to be overwhelmed and I'm not going to be able to forgive myself, or I'm going to hate America, or I'm going to hate my fellow citizens, or some version of that. I just think there's a similar kind of fear of really witnessing our history. But if you don't witness, it's not going to heal. So I don't remember the original question. I think the main point is there is a way to convince protective parts that while we understand why they're afraid of the overwhelm, that there is a way to handle that.
Mm. And maybe adding to that, one way also, because Laura, you said practices to take away, like practices to take away is look what's resourcing for me. So what's resourcing for me are parts of my body that I can feel well, where I feel already grounded. So like as if a body is like a lightning rod, my nervous system is like a lightning rod, and everything that we can ground in the ground can release itself. So often we can't ground. Traumatized information is staying stuck in the body, and then it creates all kinds of symptoms. So at least practicing, I cannot train my nervous system where it's hurt, but I can train the parts of my nervous system that are open and related and flowing. And flowing means integrated history, like millions of years being integrated in a conversation. That's flow. And hurt impairs that flow. So when I start, before I go to the pain, I learn what's resourcing in my physical body, relationally, what's resourcing when Dick sits with me. Dick's nervous system is also a resource for my nervous system, and being witnessed and felt by him, my nervous system can feel safer. So I feel you feeling me is a big resource. So how can I look who are people that are truly and genuinely listening to me when I'm in pain? Who are the people that, and especially professionals, but also in family contexts or friends, like what's my network of resourcing that helps me to feel safer, and when I'm safer I can step a little bit, and that I don't need to heal everything in one go, that there is a path. And I think learning to pace our healing work is often a part of learning internal regulation. And that was also in the question, like how is that when it's when we deal with collective pain? I think one answer is in the regulation, that I expose myself to a certain degree, but when I feel I get more overwhelmed and numb, there's no help anyway in me exposing myself more, because nothing's happening. I'm just getting more overwhelmed. So learning to be at the sweet spot of being still related to. And that's why in our work, we work a lot with the relational dimension and how we can download some traumatic content into the relational space, co-witness it, so that emotions are not just personal properties, they're actually relational properties. So when I see that I don't need to hold my fear all alone, but I can co-sense and co-feel my fear with somebody else again, then the fear is a relational glue. And that's what it's supposed to be. Emotions are supposed to be relational properties, not just individual properties that are held in a person. And so like that, we heal also the collective emotional field, starts to become like an information field that transmits information. And that also means that we are more attuned to each other's emotional states. I often say, once I need to ask you what you feel, it says that I don't feel what you feel. So that my emotional resonance is not fully in touch with your emotional resonance. And that's okay, but that's a symptom, I think, of like a traumatized world. And I think for the course, Dick, just because you mentioned that before, I think for us would be really interested also when it's about transgression and transgressors. So how does the trauma live in somebody who experienced hurt? But how does the, what I call often the shadow trauma, live in the person that committed a transgression or a crime or inflicted pain? And that kind of internalized shadow trauma, also this kind of moral wound that happens often also when we see soldiers, that's as I think an interesting topic to explore as well, but that's maybe for later.
Yeah, before we shift to the next question, I wanted to play off of something Thomas was saying that, and this might be some of where we differ, but what you were calling resourcing would be, for me, helping self embody so that you're not dominated by these other parts. And while I do agree that it's important to have a lot of support from people and that self is contagious, so if I can be in self as a therapist, that can pull for my client self. Part of how we would resource people is simply getting these parts to open space, because once self is present, there's a phrase in psychotherapy of the window of tolerance that is very related to this idea of overwhelm. And what I found, again, just through trial and error, is that self has an enormous window of tolerance, so that if otherwise, when the door opens and all the pain rushes forward, if you're in parts, you'll be overwhelmed and it'll be bad. But if you're in self, you can just be present and loving for the part that's come out that carries the pain. And that will calm that part down. And then you can begin to get it out of where it's stuck in the past. So I think we basically agree on that. We might have differences in how we resource people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So,
and my dear Thomas and Mid, yes, I was going to say, it's so lovely to hear the two of you already in this beautiful exchange. And I hope that people are getting a lot of just being here today with us. And just before, our time is getting close to when we're going to close the call, but I would like to ask both of you to share a little bit of why you each feel this course is so important now at this time in our world, and how this work can help us individually and collectively, and maybe a bit of what we can expect, what can participants expect from the sessions.
Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, first of all, I love to explore exactly what started now, the conversation about how we work, and I think that's going to be exciting. And so I feel the course is important because we feel a deep resonance with each other, and we are willing to collaborate and be together in all kinds of forms in this resonance. So that's for me at least, that's one driving factor. The other one is that I believe we are both interested in expanding the map, which we started to explore today. And I think it's actually vital to do that. I think we cannot stay anymore in a hyper-individualistic focus. In a non-bypassing way, we have to learn to differentiate different levels of our being and work on all these dimensions and find also and develop new technologies how to do that. And I think our course is one way to explore that, and also to develop that kind of more collective technology that we need to work with, or holding spaces, basically consciousness technology. And then I also think we have very pressing issues, and I think collaborations like this are also, and everybody who feels drawn to be in that conversation, I think is crucial, because I think what we discuss here, everybody can then take into wherever we affect society and apply in whichever profession and whichever way, if it's personally or professionally, in thousands of contexts. And I think we are here to really create an impact in the time when the world seems to become more shaky, and also when certain structures and identity structures that held for a long time are starting to fall apart. And I think the more we are able to stay in self, as you said, Dick, and the more we can stay aligned in that self, I think we will be of greater help in a world that is pretty kind of unpredictable at the moment.
Yeah. That was beautifully said. You know, I'll mainly just echo what you're saying. That's been my guidance. You know, I've always, like I said in the beginning, felt kind of modest about this, and like, who am I to be out there saying this is so important? But my guidance these days is you've got to get over yourself, and you've got to get this out there, and there are people you can do this with, and Thomas, you are, you know, primary one of those, and there is urgency that this, what we're both bringing, is a different paradigm for understanding human beings and human nature that is very empowering and isn't pathologizing and doesn't produce conflicts and wars. It actually does the opposite. It brings more collaboration and less individualism, less selfishness, more sense of the bigger self to which we're all connected. That each of us are an individual drop of that ocean. And with that wisdom comes just a impulse to really heal and connect and go to the traumas that keep us separate. So I think we're just totally aligned on these goals.
And one part, I think, is also that one module of our course is going to talk about the spiritual dimension within the trauma healing work. And I think both you and I have different backgrounds in that, but I think we both value and see the spiritual dimension as an important one, or the dimension of wisdom, and how that connects to the science of healing and all the new science that's around. I think that's also an important conversation to have, how that's resourcing us.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I think you got that spiritual side or the mystical side of it right away. I've come to all that kicking and screaming. But right now I'm really into it. I'm really into the mystical side of all this work.
That's beautiful, kicking and streaming. I find it lovely. And then I want to say a little bit more about how the course is going to be. I think we're going to have conversations, partly as we had it now, about different topics. We go through individual, ancestral, collective trauma healing. We go through racial trauma healing with Fatima. We will look at the spiritual dimension. We'll have one module that is also speaking about the professional side, and also two therapists. And then we're gonna have content, we're gonna have practices, meditations, inner journeys, we're gonna have live sessions. Either one of us will hold a live session with people who can apply before, and we will do example sessions of how, first of all, our work, but also how we work with these different layers of trauma and the expanded map. And then there's lots of space for Q&A and participation. And we also will work with the interdependence of the individual experience and the collective experience. Also, when somebody, for example, has a live session, how we all are not just viewers, but we are actually participants. So to tune in, to witness, to be part of, creates a collective healing experience. And so that's in a nutshell from me. Maybe you want to add something to the...
No, that's what I have in mind. So.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing and providing so much wisdom today, Thomas and Dick. And I want to thank everyone also on our call today for listening and participating through your presence. And again, we would love to invite you to join us for the upcoming course entitled Connect, Restore, Reclaim, which begins April 25th. To learn more, you can visit the website connectrestorereclaim.com. The course will include 6 live sessions for online interactive teaching, live processes, and Q&A with Thomas and Dr. Schwartz, as well as a guest speaker session, private course portal, and downloadable access to course materials, including video, audio, transcripts, and graphic recording images for each session. Plus, there are 5 additional bonuses within the course, which include a 6-part course from Thomas on the foundational teachings on collective trauma, a 3-part video series from Dr. Schwartz on IFS in the world today, a talk from the Collective Trauma Summit on healing transgenerational legacy burdens, a meditation collection for nervous system regulation and metabolizing stress, a landmark chapters from Dr. Schwartz's recent book as well as Thomas's book. So if this is of interest to you, we warmly invite you to join us for the course. To learn more, please do visit the website connectrestorereclaim.com. Thank you again for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye for now.